still remember the first time my brother told me about Misty Rain. He was fresh out of college, sitting on our parents' porch, a beer in his hand. His face lit up with that adventurous smile he always had. "It's like the forest was alive," he said. "It's breathing, it's watching. You have to see it someday, Jace." I never thought those words would haunt me. Now, standing on the edge of that same forest, the locals looking down at me unsmilingly from the safety of their homes, I couldn't help but feel like I had made a mistake. The sign marking the entrance was barely legible, the letters weathered and tattered. Misty Rain Nature Preserve. The rusty gate leaned to one side, creaking as the wind pushed it. Behind him, the trees were tall and dark, their crowns merging, blocking out most of the fading daylight. I adjusted the straps of my backpack, glanced at the map I'd borrowed from the local library, and sighed. "Okay, Ryan," I muttered to myself, "let's see where you've gone." It had been 6 months since my brother had disappeared. He and 2 friends had come here for what was supposed to be a casual weekend getaway. Only one of them had been found, a boy named Ethan. He had been found wandering along the highway 5 miles from the woods, barefoot and delirious. All he could tell the police was, "We heard it. We heard whispers." Ethan was in a mental institution now, and I wasn't allowed to see him. All I had were a few vague articles, a handful of police reports, and the nagging feeling that if I hadn't come here, I would never have known the truth. The first breath of the forest hit me as I passed through the gate. The air was cool, damp, and strangely heavy, like entering a room where someone had been crying moments before. The smell of moss and wet earth was overwhelming, and the mist that gave the ravine its name seemed to hang in wisps, curling around the base of the trees and spilling down the narrow dirt path before me. The first hour wasn't too bad. The path was overgrown, but still visible, winding through thick clumps of ferns and thorny bushes. I heard the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, branches rustling in the wind. But then the silence began to fall. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, as if someone were turning down a dial. The birdsong became sporadic, then stopped altogether. The wind died down too, leaving the air unnaturally still. Even my footsteps sounded muffled, as if the forest swallowed the sound. I tried to shake it off. "It's just a quiet forest," I told myself, but my voice sounded too loud, unnatural in the oppressive silence. I kept walking, and then I heard the first whisper. I stopped mid-step, every muscle in my body tensing. It wasn't a voice I recognized, just a faint murmur. So quiet I wasn't even sure I heard it. It seemed to come from behind the trees to my left, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just moss-covered trunks and a thick wall of undergrowth. "Hello!" I shouted, my voice shaking, even though I tried to sound calm. The whispers stopped. I moved on, my nerves aching with every step. The air grew heavier, the fog thicker, and the forest darker, though the sun hadn't quite set yet. My flashlight wasn't much help. The beam seemed lost in the haze, barely illuminating the path ahead. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed less like a hiking trail and more like something natural. The dirt was softer, the edges were blurred, and there was no sign of other hikers, no tracks, no litter, nothing. Just me and the forest. I kept going, but my anxiety only grew. Every now and then I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. The flicker of a shadow running through the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. An hour later I came across the first sign of them. They were gone. It was a scarf caught on a branch by the trail. Bright red, frayed at the edges, fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. I didn't recognize it as Ryan's, but the sight made my stomach drop anyway. I hesitated, debating whether to leave it there or take it as a clue, but I did. I didn't want to disturb anything. Not yet. The whisper came again, louder this time. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. It was a voice, low and insistent, coming from deep in the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded close. Too close. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking. Silence. And then, as I was about to turn back onto the trail, I saw something else. Footprints. They don't look like mine. There was no mistaking the sound. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, and far too close for comfort. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and strained to listen. The rhythm of the steps was distinct from mine, crunching softly over the forest floor before stopping altogether. My pulse pounded in my ears as the silence wrapped itself around me like a noose. I didn't dare look back at first. Something about the weight of the silence made me feel like turning around would only make it worse. But the rational part of me, the part that still clung to some shred of logic, whispered that it was probably just another hiker. Someone who had wandered too far off the trail. When I finally turned, there was nothing. The trees stood motionless, shrouded in mist. The underbrush swayed faintly, but not from wind. It was too still for that. I waited for a moment longer, staring into the haze, but the forest offered no answers. Whatever or whoever had been there was gone. The tension in my chest didn't ease, though. My skin prickled with unease, like I was being watched. I shook it off and pushed forward, forcing my legs to keep moving. The sooner I got to the clearing where Ryan had last been seen, the sooner I could figure out what had happened to him. The forest seemed to grow darker as I went. The canopy above thickened, blotting out what little daylight remained. My flashlight was practically useless now. The beam barely cut through the mist, illuminating only the few feet of path directly in front of me. That was when I started noticing the items. The first was a battered water bottle, its label faded and peeling. It lay half buried in the dirt, covered in a thin layer of moss. A few yards later, I spotted a hiking boot, its laces frayed and broken. Then a torn backpack, its contents scattered and soggy from the damp. Each object felt like a breadcrumb, a remnant of someone else's journey that had ended too soon. They weren't Ryan's, at least I didn't think they were. But they still sent a chill down my spine. It was as if the forest were cataloging its victims, leaving their belongings as silent reminders of their failure to escape. The whispers returned. This time, they were louder and more distinct, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to tell how many voices there were. They didn't seem to be coming from any one direction. Instead, they surrounded me, seeping out of the trees and the mist, filling the air with a low, unintelligible murmur. My pace quickened, almost without thinking. My pulse thudded in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder as I moved, their cadence rising and falling like the tide. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the silhouette. It was faint, just a shadowy figure standing between two trees off the trail. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, barely visible through the haze. My steps faltered, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, it faded into the mist, dissolving like smoke. I didn't wait to see if it would reappear. I forced myself to keep going, my legs trembling with every step. The trail grew narrower and more overgrown, the trees pressing closer together as if the forest were closing in around me. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. The mist was thinner here, revealing a circle of blackened soil in the center. The ground was barren, as if nothing had grown there for years. At the edge of the clearing stood an old wooden statue, its surface warped and cracked with age. The figure was crude, barely human in shape, its limbs twisted and elongated. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, the features worn smooth by time and weather. Despite its simplicity, it exuded a strange sense of malevolence, like it didn't belong in this world. A cold dread settled over me as I approached the statue, my every instinct screaming to turn back. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It was heavy and oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. At the base of the statue, half buried in the blackened soil, was a notebook. The edges of the pages were damp, the ink smudged in places, but I recognized it immediately. It was Ryan's. I crouched down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The cover was scratched and dirty, but it was unmistakable. My heart raced as I flipped it open, scanning the pages for any clue, any explanation. The entries were short, disjointed. Notes about the trail, sketches of trees and animals, a few random thoughts scrawled in his messy handwriting. But as I flipped further, the tone of the entries changed. The last page stopped me cold. In jagged, frantic writing, one phrase was repeated over and over, filling the entire page. The forest took me. The words blurred on the page as my mind raced to make sense of them. I couldn't tell if it was the damp air or my own trembling hands that made the ink look like it was running, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The forest took me. Over and over again, the same phrase scrawled in Ryan's unmistakable handwriting. The whispers began again, softer this time, like they were right behind me. I froze, clutching the notebook to my chest, my eyes darting around the clearing. The air felt heavier now, the stillness around me alive with tension. And then I realized something. The trail I had followed into the clearing, it was gone. I spun around, trying to retrace my steps, but the path I had taken was nowhere to be seen. Where there had been a narrow dirt trail was now just more forest, endless and unbroken, the trees pressing in like a crowd. Panic clawed at my chest as I turned in circles, scanning the edge of the clearing for any sign of where I had come from. Nothing. It wasn't possible. I'd been careful, marking my route on the map, following the trail as closely as I could. But now the forest seemed different, as though it had rearranged itself the moment I looked away. I forced myself to take a deep breath, shoving the notebook into my backpack. I needed to stay calm, to think. The clearing couldn't be that far off the main trail. I'd find it again if I just kept moving. The statue loomed behind me, its warped and twisted form casting long shadows across the clearing. I avoided looking at it as I stepped away, the weight of its presence sending a cold shiver down my spine. The whispers followed me as I walked, growing fainter as I pushed into the trees, but they never disappeared entirely. The forest felt different now. The air was colder, and the mist clung to me like wet fingers. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rasp of my own breath, and yet, the silence between those sounds seemed to stretch on forever. The belongings started appearing again. A pair of cracked sunglasses dangling from a low branch, a tattered map pinned to the ground by a jagged rock, a single hiking boot, its sole worn smooth. Each object felt deliberately placed, as if the forest was leading me somewhere. I pressed on, trying not to think about how far I might have strayed from the clearing. The mist grew thicker, swirling around my ankles and obscuring the ground ahead. My flashlight was useless now, the beam bouncing off the haze and scattering in all directions. I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't see them, but I felt them. Shadows moving just out of sight, slipping between the trees. Shapes that didn't belong, their outlines shifting and indistinct. Every time I turned my head, they vanished, but the feeling of being watched never left. I stumbled over a tree root, catching myself on a nearby trunk. My heart was pounding, the raw edge of panic creeping closer with every step. The whispers grew louder again, no longer faint and distant but urgent, insistent. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I turned sharply. There, in the mist, was a figure. It was standing several yards away, partially obscured by the haze, but it was unmistakably human. Its posture was stiff, unnatural, and it was facing away from me. I couldn't see its face, just the back of its head, its shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Something about the figure felt wrong. It didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, frozen in place, like a mannequin abandoned in the woods. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. I was close enough now to see the faint outline of its clothes dark, tattered, clinging to its frame. Then, with a sudden, jerking motion, it turned its head. The movement was wrong, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face was obscured by the mist, but I saw enough. The hollow eyes, the slack, expressionless mouth, the way its neck bent at an angle no neck should bend. I stumbled back, my stomach lurching as bile rose in my throat. The figure didn't follow. It just stood there, staring at me through the haze, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. I turned and ran. Branches clawed at my arms and legs as I sprinted through the forest, the mist whipping past me in streaks of white. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was. The whispers grew louder as I ran, a chorus of voices overlapping in a dissonant hum. The forest seemed alive around me, the trees twisting and shifting as if they were reaching out to grab me. Finally, I broke into another clearing. My chest heaved as I bent over, gasping for breath. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a solid weight. And then I saw it. Another statue, identical to the first. I stared at the statue, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. It was the same warped figure, the same unnatural proportions, the same dark, rotting wood. It stood in the center of the clearing, the surrounding mist curling around its base like something alive. My mind raced. Couldn't be the same one. I'd run in a straight line, at least I thought I had. The clearing felt different. The trees closer together, the ground softer and more uneven. But the statue was unmistakable. I took a hesitant step closer, my legs trembling beneath me. The figure seemed even more menacing now, the twisted contours of its body casting long, jagged shadows across the blackened soil. Its head was tilted in that same unnatural way, as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. That was when I noticed the marks. Carved into the ground around the statue was a series of symbols, etched deep into the earth. They formed a rough circle, their shapes jagged and uneven, like they'd been scratched into the dirt by desperate hands. I didn't recognize any of them. There were no familiar runes or patterns, just crude, angular shapes that made my skin crawl. I circled the statue, careful not to step inside the marked area. My eyes caught on something resting at its base, a pile of objects, half buried in the black soil. Clothing, shoes, a cracked thermos. They were scattered haphazardly, as though they'd been tossed there without care. But there was something deliberate about their placement. Among them was a faded blue bandana. My stomach dropped. Ryan's bandana. He'd had it with him the last time I saw him, tied around his wrist like he always wore it. My legs felt like they were moving on their own as I stepped toward the statue, reaching for the bandana with trembling fingers. The moment my hand touched it, the whispers returned. They erupted all around me, louder than ever before, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the forest itself. I stumbled back, clutching the bandana in my hand, my eyes darting wildly around the clearing. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting and writhing like living things. The shadows moved. I saw them at the edge of the clearing, slipping between the trees. They were human-shaped, but their movements were jerky and unnatural, their forms blending with the mist. They didn't come closer, just circled the clearing, their hollow eyes watching me from the darkness. I backed away from the statue, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The bandana was still clutched in my hand, the fabric damp and cold against my skin. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, the voices overlapping until they were impossible to distinguish. A low creaking sound made me whip around, and my heart nearly stopped. The statue was moving. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but I saw it. The twisted figure shifted, its head tilting further to the side, its elongated limbs creaking as they adjusted. It wasn't alive, not in the way a person or animal was, but it wasn't still either. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices rising in a chorus of unintelligible sound. My head felt like it was splitting open, the noise reverberating in my skull. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the blackened soil. For a moment, everything went still. The whispers stopped. The shadows froze. Even the statue seemed to pause, its warped form looming over me in eerie silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard it. A single broken voice. Jason! It was faint, barely audible over the ringing in my ears, but I recognized it instantly. Ryan. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing as I scanned the trees. The voice came again, louder this time, cutting through the oppressive silence like a lifeline. It sounded close, too close, as though he was just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Jason!" I didn't think. I didn't question. I ran toward the sound, plunging back into the forest without a second thought. The trees blurred past me, their branches clawing at my arms and face as I pushed through the undergrowth. The mist was thicker than ever, clinging to me like a second skin, but I didn't care. All that mattered was the voice. It led me deeper, the sound growing louder and more desperate with every step. I called out his name, my voice hoarse and frantic, but there was no response. Only that single pleading word, repeated over and over like a broken record. "Jason!" I stumbled into another clearing, smaller this time, the mist so thick I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The voice had stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, as I turned in circles, searching for any sign of him. And then I saw him, Ryan. He was standing at the far edge of the clearing, his back to me, his figure barely visible through the haze. His clothes were tattered, his hair matted and unkempt. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there like a statue of his own. I called his name, my voice shaking, but he didn't respond. Slowly, hesitantly, I took a step toward him, and then another, and then he turned. Ryan turned slowly, unnaturally, as though the act of moving was foreign to him. His body twisted first, shoulders and arms angling awkwardly, and then his head followed. When I saw his face, I froze. It was Ryan, or it had been. His features were familiar. The sharp line of his jaw, the way his hair fell into his eyes. But his skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were wrong. The irises were cloudy and distant, like looking into a pair of fogged-over mirrors. There was no recognition in them, no spark of life. He stared at me, his head tilted slightly to one side. His lips parted, and a sound came out. Not words at first, just a rasping breath, shallow and uneven, as if speaking was something he hadn't done in a very long time. And then, finally, he spoke. "The forest took me." The words were flat, mechanical, repeated as if they were all he remembered how to say. They hung in the air, echoing unnaturally, as though the forest itself was repeating them back to me. I took a step closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "Ryan!" I barely recognized my own voice, trembling and thin. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring through me, his mouth moving as he repeated the same phrase again. "The forest took me." The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them. Hollow, detached, as though he wasn't the one speaking. Like the forest had reached inside him and was using him as a puppet. I took another step and he flinched. It was barely noticeable. A slight twitch of his shoulder, a subtle recoil. But it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the way he looked or spoke. It was the air around him, the way the mist seemed to cling to his body, swirling unnaturally as if it was part of him. The ground beneath his feet was darker, the soil black and cracked, radiating outward like a wound in the earth. He took a step forward, his movements jerky and uneven. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head lolling slightly as he moved. Every instinct I had screamed at me to back away, to turn and run, but my legs refused to obey. The forest took me. He was closer now, close enough that I could see the faint tremor in his hands, the way his chest barely rose and fell with each breath. I reached out, my hand trembling, desperate to touch him, to feel some proof that he was real. But before I could, he stopped. The change was instant, his entire body going rigid as though he'd been struck. His head snapped up, and for the first time his eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A flicker of recognition, a spark of the brother I knew buried deep beneath the surface. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by something else. Something ancient. He opened his mouth, and the whispers returned, pouring out of him like a flood. They were louder than ever, a chaotic chorus of overlapping voices that seemed to echo from every direction. The sound was overwhelming, a pressure that pushed against my skull and made my knees buckle. I stumbled back, clutching my ears, but the whispers didn't stop. Ryan's lips didn't move, but the sound kept coming, rising to a deafening roar that seemed to fill the entire clearing. And then he moved again. He didn't walk. He lunged, his body jerking forward with unnatural speed. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as he crashed past me, his limbs flailing as though he had no control over them. He hit the ground hard, but the impact didn't stop him. He scrambled to his feet, his movements erratic and frantic, and turned toward me again. I ran. I didn't look back, just sprinted into the trees, the whispers still ringing in my ears. Branches whipped at my face, the mist blinding me as I stumbled through the undergrowth. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Behind me I could hear him, the sound of his footsteps crashing through the forest, growing closer with every second. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. No Ryan, no movement, just the endless expanse of trees and mist. My chest heaved as I slowed to a stop, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The silence was suffocating, heavier than before. I turned back to the path ahead, trying to get my bearings, and froze. He was there, standing directly in front of me, his head tilted at that unnatural angle, his hollow eyes fixed on mine. "The forest," he whispered, his voice softer now, almost gentle. I didn't move, couldn't. And then his face twisted, his features contorting into something I barely recognized. His mouth stretched too wide, his jaw cracking as it opened, and a sound came out. Not words this time, but a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. The forest seemed to respond. The mist thickened, swirling around us like a living thing, and the ground beneath me shifted, the soil turning soft and unstable. Ryan, or whatever he had become, took a step closer. Ryan stepped closer, his feet sinking slightly into the soft, blackened soil. The mist swirled thicker now, tendrils of it curling around his legs, stretching toward me like outstretched fingers. His face, a grotesque mask of my brother and something else entirely, was frozen in that unnatural expression. His jaw slack, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't move. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to escape, but my legs felt rooted in place. The forest pressed in from all sides, the shadows alive with movement, watching, waiting. And then Ryan, or the thing wearing his face, spoke again. The forest took me. The voice was layered now, fractured and broken, as if a dozen others were speaking through him. The sound made my head pound, my ears ring, but the words themselves weren't what terrified me. It was the finality in them, the absolute, unshakable truth. I forced myself to step back, my foot catching on a root as I stumbled. The mist seemed to tighten around me, the air growing colder with every passing second. My hand brushed against my backpack, and I remembered the notebook, the last thing I had of Ryan's, now shoved deep inside. Some part of me, the part desperate to believe he was still in there, made me speak. My voice came out as a rasp, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "Ryan, it's me. I'm here to bring you home." For a moment, nothing happened. He stood there, still as stone, his head tilted slightly as though he were trying to process my words. But then his face changed again, his features twisting in a way that no human face should. His mouth opened, impossibly wide, and the whispers erupted again, pouring out of him like a flood. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the soil breaking apart in jagged cracks that spread outward like veins. From those cracks came something black and viscous, a tar-like substance that oozed up from the earth and coated the forest floor. The air grew heavier, suffocating, as the whispers rose to a deafening roar. Ryan lurched toward me, his movements unnatural, his arms reaching out with fingers that twitched and clawed. I stumbled backward, panic overtaking me as I turned and ran. But there was nowhere to go. The trees had closed in, their twisted trunks forming an impenetrable wall. The mist was everywhere now, a dense, living thing that clung to my skin and filled my lungs with every breath. The ground beneath me grew softer, pulling at my feet with every step. I turned, desperate to find another way, and froze. The statue was there again, standing impossibly in the middle of the clearing. Its warped, elongated form loomed over me, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle, as though it were mocking me. At its base, the black tar bubbled and frothed, spilling outward and consuming the objects scattered around it. The bandana, the water bottles, the torn backpacks. And then I saw it. The cracks in the earth weren't random. They formed a pattern, a spiral radiating outward from the statue, the symbols carved into the ground glowing faintly in the dim light. The realization hit me all at once. The forest wasn't just alive, it was feeding. And Ryan was already a part of it. The whispers grew louder, drilling into my skull, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head. The black tar crept closer, lapping at my boots, and I felt it pulling, dragging me down into the earth. The forest wanted me. No, somehow, through the chaos, I forced myself to move. My hand shot out, grabbing a loose branch from the ground, and I swung it with everything I had at the base of the statue. The wood cracked, splintering under the force, but it didn't break. Again, the whispers screamed in protest, the mist writhing around me like a living thing. My head pounded, my vision blurred, but I kept swinging, each blow splintering the warped figure further. With one final swing, the statue shattered, collapsing into a heap of broken wood and blackened soil. The moment it fell, the whispers stopped. The forest went silent. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was over. The mist began to thin, the oppressive weight in the air lifting slightly. But then I saw Ryan. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless, his head tilted in that same unnatural way. His lips parted, and though no sound came out, I knew what he was saying. The forest took me. The ground beneath him cracked open, the black tar swallowing him whole. His body sank into the earth, vanishing into the spiral of symbols, and then he was gone. The mist closed in again, thicker than before. The forest grew darker, the air colder, and I realized the truth. Destroying the statue hadn't saved anyone. It had only made the forest stronger. I ran, blind and panicked, not knowing if I was heading deeper into the forest or toward its edge. The trees blurred together, the mist choking me with every step. The last thing I remember is the ground giving way beneath me, a sensation of falling, and then, nothing. I woke up hours later, or maybe days. I was lying on the side of the highway, my clothes damp and torn, my backpack missing. There was no sign of the forest, no sign of Ryan. Just the endless expanse of asphalt stretching into the distance. I don't know how I got out. I don't think I ever truly did. The forest is still with me. I feel it in the back of my mind, in the whispers that come to me when I'm alone. Sometimes, I see Ryan in my dreams, standing in the mist, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. The forest took him, and now it's waiting for me,